We've seen this quote before from Socrates, where at his trial he asks the leadership of Athens and the people of Athens generally, will you not spend thought or care on wisdom and truth and the perfecting of your soul, the perfecting of your way of being in this world? And when it comes to thinking about that kind of work, working on our way of being in this world, I think of another great Athenian, and that is Aristotle and his work on ethics. In a previous discussion, we mentioned eudaimonia or eudaimonia, and it's this Greek concept often translated in English as happiness. The prefix there, eu, meaning good, daimon meaning spirit, so literally the word means good-spiritedness. Sometimes in English it's translated as a sense of flourishing, human flourishing. Oftentimes the word given is happiness, and this is the term that we're working with here, and we'll work with it a bit more in other discussions. In the previous discussion, we looked at Aristotle's idea of the golden mean, that if a person wants to experience eudaimonia, however you want to pronounce it, then one of the things this person does is he gets life right. These decisions, these ethical decisions that continuously confront us, this person gets these decisions right, and it's easy to go wrong, in one direction or another, but really getting it right, that's tough, and we discussed this in the previous conversation, and we looked at the case of there you are, once again, the person you're supposed to meet is 15 minutes late. What's the right response to that? We looked at the case of Antigone and said that perhaps Antigone didn't get things exactly right, but, pretty close to right. We looked at the case of Socrates and his response to the leadership of Athens, telling him that he had to stop teaching, and perhaps he didn't absolutely nail it, right? But I think a lot of people would agree he got pretty close to it. We looked at the case of the Cowardly Lion from The Wizard of Oz, and I think we saw that the lion went from one extreme to another, but didn't really come anywhere near, getting the situation right. And we looked at this, and there are many other similar things we can look at that kind of get at this idea Aristotle has, that we can use the word virtues, right? There are moral characteristics, for example, mercy, patience, self-control. And, people want to show mercy, right? But showing mercy in the right way, in a given situation, it's not always easy to know exactly how to do that. There are a lot of ways to go wrong. There are many fewer ways to go right. And there are a lot of these kinds of schemes that we can look at to have a sense of sort of what Aristotle's talking about. One of the things that Aristotle says is that if we want to experience eudaimonia, then this is going to be the result of work. That being a good person, being a person of virtue, being a person of integrity, being a person of honor, being a person of justice, this takes work, right? This takes practice. We've said it a number of times. Aristotle makes the point that you become a good piano player by practicing. I mean, no 2-year-old all of a sudden becomes a great piano player. A 2-year-old can become a great piano player as time goes by through practice, right? And no one ever looks at a 2-year-old and says, wow, that 2-year-old is really just a person of integrity, right? We hope that 2-year-old will grow into a person of integrity, but that comes as the result of practice. And Aristotle says we have to apply our minds. We have to, consider situations. We have to learn from situations. This is why good literature is so important. This is why these kinds of conversations are so important, because they help us to think through scenarios that, can come up in life. And we can think about how should we approach these kinds of things when they come up. So Aristotle says we must apply our minds to the problem of how our actions should be performed. So we know that we should do something, and we have a basic idea of what we should do, but now we're thinking about, how exactly should I do what I think I should do? Let's take the example of health. So Aristotle says that both excessive and insufficient exercise destroy one's health. Eating and drinking too much or too little also destroys health. So when it comes to exercise, when it comes to eating and drinking, we want to get it right. So the same thing, you've got extremes and then you've got the middle, right? And so no one says, if you ask somebody, what have you been doing the past month? If the person says, well, pretty much I spend all day laying on the couch eating potato chips and watching TV. I mean, it's hard to imagine anybody saying, wow, I mean, you're really living a great life. That's not the model of a great life. That would kind of be a deficiency when it comes to health. Probably less common, although it still happens, with people who take it too far. They exercise too much. I mean, to the point where it's actually dangerous for them. And I do know of a situation where this happened, sort of in the world I lived in, where there was a young person who just seemed to be continuously exercising to the point that it was unhealthy, and people became concerned about that person. So this can happen, right? And so we don't want to go to one extreme or another. We want to find that middle ground, that ground that we describe as good health, right? And the same thing is true of many other characteristics. We want to be generous, right? But we don't want to be so generous that it's harmful, because we're giving, we're sacrificing our own livelihood for other people. We're endangering the livelihoods of people we're responsible for because we're giving so much away. On the other hand, we don't want to be stingy and selfish and in no way generous. And so getting that right can sometimes be a challenge. And so Aristotle says we have to apply our minds, and we've got to, think things through and practice. And that's why these kinds of conversations, that's why studying literature and studying what people do in history and all that, that's why it's so important. Aristotle says that a virtuous life, that is a life of moral goodness, a life of decency, it requires exertion, right? It requires exertion, it requires practice. Virtue, Aristotle says, moral excellence, moral goodness, right? It lies in our power, and so does vice. Human beings have a choice, right? It's in our power, Aristotle says, to be decent or worthless. Now, worthless, that sounds pretty harsh. I don't know if we'd want to go along with that word. That's a pretty strong word, but we get Aristotle's idea. It's in our power. If I'm going to be a person who is or not trustworthy, that lies in my power. I decide whether or not I will do things that will help me to be a trustworthy person. I also decide if I won't do those things. That lies in my power, right? And it requires some exertion. It requires some work. So this is an interesting thing to notice, that Aristotle's saying that if we want to have a sense of contentedness of soul, if we want to flourish as human beings, if we want to have that sort of internal sense of eudaimonia, right, then that's the result of work. That's the result of hard work. There are things that make it that make this challenging, right? One of the things is just life itself. That life itself can be challenging and difficult. And I'm reminded of this road in Maui in Hawaii, where my family, we got on this road after being advised by multiple people not to get on this road. And once we spent some time on this road, we understood why people advised us not to get on this road, because at moments it was just terrifying, and you can't see around the corners to come. There were some moments of beauty, of where what we saw was beautiful, and there were other moments that were pretty scary, right? And life can be like that. Everything seems to be going great, but then but we can't see around the corner. We can't be absolutely sure of what's coming at us. And so life itself can be difficult and challenging, and throw all sorts of challenges at us. And that makes this moral work that Aristotle is talking about, that can make it all the more difficult, because we're preoccupied with with the challenges that come at us, the challenges seem to be enough, and then Aristotle's saying now we have to think about our correct response to these challenges, and so that's one of the things that makes it tough. And I have the book there, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, right? And a core theme of this book is just the challenge of getting through this world, and this involves psychological struggles and spiritual struggles, and it's a book that's worth our time. Something else that makes it hard to know exactly how to make decisions and how to respond, and this would be related, going back to that topic of health, is that Aristotle notices that getting things exactly right is relative to each person, because people are different. They have different abilities, right? They're at different stages in life. So, for example, when it comes to, let's focus on that topic of health. When it comes to health, a person who gets it right, who is, say, 80 years old, that's going to look different, probably, than a person who's 20, right? Or if a person, for one reason or another, is wheelchair bound, that is, has to, live life in a wheelchair, well, of course, then when it comes to the question of exercise related to health, that's going to look different than it will for a person who is able to, play traditional soccer. Among marathon runners, right? One person will be able to run a marathon in 2.5 hours, and another person will be able to do it in 5 hours. And for both, that can be, really getting it right, just depending on the circumstances, on that person's particular gifts, on that person's particular, kinds of energy, etc. And so this is kind of a complicating thing, right? That when it comes to basketball, for example, there's only one Michael Jordan, right? There's only one LeBron James, right? But that doesn't mean that basketball players cannot excel in their own worlds given their own gifts, right? And so I think the idea that we're after here is, sometimes we hear this phrase, be the best you that you can be, right? And that really is an idea that's in Aristotle's Ethics. You have your own personality, you have your own energy, right? You have your own interests, right? And you getting things exactly right, that's probably going to look different from another person with a different personality, with a different kind of energy, etc. So this is one of the things that can make things a little complicated as we're walking through our lives. And we mentioned differences in personality. Some people are extroverted, some people are introverted, right? Some people gain energy from being around other people. These would be extroverts. Introverts tend to be drained after spending time with other people, and they want to go and be by themselves, right? And so, for example, when it comes to the topic of friendliness, getting friendliness right for an introvert is probably going to look different from an extrovert. And an extrovert, from an extrovert's point of view, the introvert's form of friendliness may not be very impressive, From the introvert's point of view, on the other hand, introverts they don't tend to enjoy, big parties and things like that, not to the extent that extroverts do. They do tend to be pretty good at having a small number of close friends, right? And so when it comes to the topic of friendship, maybe an introvert would see that, the extrovert's running around, sort of doing all these different things, whereas I'm focused on just a small number of people, right? And so you're going to have different perspectives. I think one of the things this means is that, just recognizing that people are different. They have different personalities, as I've said, different kinds of energy, right? Different ways of being. And, under no circumstances, I think, can a person say, well, my way of being is to be a bank robber, and so therefore I just want to be the best bank robber I can be, right? Because stealing is not virtuous, right? So no one can say that, okay? So there are boundaries, right? There are basic ethical standards. Truthfulness, honor, generosity, mercy, grace. But people are going to respond to these things in different ways, depending on their personalities and depending on other situations. And so we recognize this, and Aristotle recognizes this. People are different. And so we want to to get it right as well as we can, recognizing that our way of doing that is likely to be different from another person with with a different personality, okay, with a different way of being, with a different interests, etc. So all of these things make this kind of a complicated situation. Something else that comes in is human nature, right? And extroverts and introverts, they can be very different in how they operate, but there does seem to be a human nature that human beings share, right? And Plato, says this, and we've seen this quote before. He says that within every person, even someone who seems very restrained, there are desires which are terrible and wild and lawless, right? Now, this may be more obvious in some people than others, but Plato's idea is that this kind of tension exists in every person. We remember the Hebrew story, right? The Garden of Eden. And here we see this very complicated creature, right? Human beings, they've got it made. These two people in the Garden of Eden have got it made, right? But there's something within them that drives them to mess it up, right? And so we see that conflicted human creature again. And Plato describes human beings as kind of conflicted creatures. We see this conflicted creature at work, even in the Garden of Eden. And then St. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, describes things this way. He said, people want to do wrong things that the Spirit does not want them to do, right? Paul here, of course, an early Christian writer, referring to the Holy Spirit. So people have certain desires, and then the Holy Spirit has certain desires, right? And these desires clash, right? The Spirit wants people to do things they do not want to do. The Spirit and the wrong things you want to do are against each other, so that you do not do what you yourself want to do. Okay, that sounds kind of complicated, but basically the idea is that people, there's a kind of conflict, because there's the one side of them saying I should do this, there's the other side of them saying I should do that, right? And that sounds a little bit like what Plato describes in the previous quote. And Aristotle, I think, although he doesn't know the Christian conception of the Holy Spirit, I think he would basically go along, he understands what St. Paul's getting at, that people are conflicted, right? And Aristotle says, the person who's going to experience eudaimonia is the person who really figures out how to resolve this conflict, right? How to listen to the right voice, how to follow the right impulse, right? And the person who does that consistently well is a good candidate for eudaimonia. And so the virtuous life requires exertion. Virtue lies in our power. We have to make choices, and it takes some work. Aristotle describes a person of good character, and he says this person judges every situation rightly. Okay, that sounds daunting. Every situation, this person gets it right. Every interaction, this person gets it right. Every back and forth with emails or texting or whatever, this person gets it right. Probably what makes the person of good character stand out. And so notice Aristotle's implication. The person who gets it right every time, that person probably doesn't exist. I don't know if we're ever going to have an absolutely perfect person, but the person who gets it right most of the time is going to stand out. People will recognize it, right? And the reason this person stands out, or what makes this person stands out, is the fact that he or she sees the truth in every kind of situation. So do a quick calculation. So what's going on here? What's the right way to respond? This person is a sort of standard and yardstick of what is fine and pleasant. This is the person who just seems to get it right. This is the person of honor. This is the person of integrity. This is the trustworthy person, right? This is the person we respect. This is the person we appreciate. All right, this person gets these interactions right seemingly every time. But then there's the other side. There's the sort of person who doesn't take care. This person is not thinking, this person is clueless, this person is not paying attention, this person is acting on impulse, this person says whatever comes to his or her mind. People get into this condition through their own fault. So notice Aristotle's really emphasizing the power that human beings have to decide what kind of people they want to be. People get into this condition through their own fault by the slackness of their lives. They're not paying attention, right? They're not doing the kind of work that we're talking about. And they make themselves unjust by behaving dishonestly, right? Just as a person can guarantee that he or she never becomes a good piano player because there's no real practice that goes into it, so a person can be unjust because justice has never been practiced in this person's life. Goodness has not much been practiced, right? This person has not set out a goal of being a person of honor and integrity, and therefore the person is not a person of honor and integrity. And so we come to a warning from Aristotle. And Aristotle describes a person who goes to the doctor. This person is sick, goes to the doctor. The doctor says, if you don't want to be sick anymore, this is what you have to do. And the person who's sick hears the doctor, understands what the doctor says, and then does not do what the doctor says to do. And consequently, the person's sickness continues, and at some point it's too late. At some point it's too late. And this is why, to repeat something we've said a number of times before, Aristotle says these kinds of conversations need to start from the earliest age, because at some point it's too late. And Aristotle says there was a time when it was open to the sick person not to be ill. But when he had once thrown away his chance, it was gone. Oh, those words always hit me. Those words always strike me, right? Aristotle's saying, listen, if we want to be people of honor, of justice and integrity, then we've got to do some work, right? And we have to exert our will, and we've got to put some effort into this. So important, so important. So Aristotle says the person of good character judges every situation rightly. Well, I'm stuck on that word every, right? And I think, well, I mean, that's a goal, right? That's a goal, to judge every situation rightly. That's the goal. Understanding, perfection in this world is tough, but let's make that the goal. And Aristotle says for this person, eudaimonia is possible, because this person can reflect on his or her life and say, you know what, man, I was at it. I was busy at the work of life, trying to get it right, learning from my mistakes, watching mistakes other people make, also learning from the good things, from the successes of others, learning from my own successes, right? Learning from mistakes and successes, putting that to work, right? Being thoughtful in life, not being thoughtless, right? So there's the one person who is working hard to judge every situation rightly, and then to determine how should I respond. And then there's the other sort of person, though, who doesn't take care. This person's kind of stumbling through life day by day, not thinking about it, right? Yeah. Aristotle says for that person, eudaimonia is not possible. Yeah, that person can have fun, that person can be amused, that person can be entertained, but this person cannot experience what Aristotle calls eudaimonia, sense of profound contentment of soul, contentment of spirit. As we look at these two descriptions, I think it's pretty obvious which one we want to go for.